Welcome back. Now, as we were hearing in Limerick, the rental market is putting a strain on many people when it comes to the money in their pockets. And today's report from daft.ie lays that bare. Prices going up by 10% nationally in the last few months of 2021. Here to discuss this and more are Rory Hearne, Assistant Professor of Social Policy at Maynooth University, Karl Deeter, who's a financial advisor, and Fionnan, Sheahan, Ireland editor at independent.ie. Rory, I'll start with yourself. 10% in a year is astronomical by anyone's terms. Is that a sign of the market working, or maybe working for some people but not others?
Yeah, the rents, again, incredible. Renters are struggling. 10%, but if we look at places like Mayo, Sligo, it was 20%. Like, that's just incredible. Like, that's not sustainable at any level. The rental system, if we look at it now, supply is down a lot in terms of new rentals coming on board. But the real problem here is, at one level we have, as I said, places like Mayo, Sligo, around the country, rents increasing as high as 20%. The rent pressure zones don't cover these areas. That's part of the problem.
Well, even if they did, rent pressure zones will only apply to existing tenancies. But presumably, if these are being advertised on Daft, it's for new people going into new properties, so it would never have applied anyway.
Exactly, and that's part of the problem. We're seeing that new tenancies aren't covered by the existing rent caps. We also see that even in the rent pressure zones, rent increasing 10% way beyond the existing caps. And so
how can rent be going up that much if the market has already limited existing tenancies to 2%? How can there be a commercial demand for things to go up that much if there's already a ceiling in place that limits what existing tenants can pay? Surely that's dragging backwards the market.
Well, see, the issue is that, as you said, these rents are new rental tenancies that are coming to the market, and this is what the rent is. So this is what's increasing. So it doesn't tell you much about what is happening existing rents. But what it does tell us very clearly is that new rental properties are absolutely unaffordable. There is not enough of them. But a big problem is the role of investor funds in this. We know a significant amount of the new property coming to the market is really unaffordable rentals. And initially, I've been criticised for calling them vulture funds. I actually think it would be more appropriate to call them vampire funds, because essentially what they're going to be doing is feeding off generation rent for decades to come. This is what is happening in this country. And also, the investor funds don't build anywhere outside Dublin. So we have this problem. Who is supplying the homes outside Dublin? And the government has refused consistently to put in place a rental cap that would freeze rents and not allow them continuously increase.
Karl Deeter, you had a slight sort of frown there when you heard that there was no properties being developed outside Dublin. I don't know whether that's something you agree, but what do you take on the idea of vampire funds taking their living off the rest of us for generations?
That's good terminology. Coins like nice phrases, vultures, vampires.
Well, cuckoos is appropriate, isn't it? Because they're taking stuff that isn't really intended for them.
Think about it like this. Imagine we didn't have them at all. Would you be happier? If we didn't have any of those houses, would we be better off then?
But they're no good as an affordable supply. They're not a supply of affordable housing.
Would we be better off without those houses? No.
We absolutely would, because then you could actually use the land that they're building to actually build homes on, affordable homes.
But that's part of the doesn't exist in this realm type of thinking. I mean, that's Star Wars stuff. Like,
Karl,
you could reverse time and somehow go forward again and have some different outcome. If you don't have those homes, by the way, when a house gets rented out, even if it's unaffordable, assuming that whoever moves in there can afford it, they normally free out somewhere else down the chain as well. And this is why even when a house is bought for €1 million, it actually creates housing. It loosens up housing right down all the way to the bottom.
It surely can't be positive, though, having that report today from BNP Paribas that says that 4,900 homes were bought by institutional investors last year, which could otherwise have been bought by families to raise their children or by private people who just want their own roof over their heads. It's hardly good for the market if those are completely taken away and are now rental only.
Look, a part of me wants to agree with that, because that would mean loads of mortgages and I'd be a beneficiary in some sense from that. But let's not forget, renters are people too. Okay, so you can't just say renting bad, buying good, whoever the landlord is, they're bad, certain types of landlord are good. Like, for years we were told we need professional landlords. Now we have them and no one seems happy about it.
Surely the market has overcorrected, though, of those people who they were intended to be brought in so that they would provide new properties, but they're often not providing new properties. They're taking properties that someone else has built, which is why they're called cuckoos.
Well, and we did change rules for them, and we keep on meddling with it. But the whole thing is, if you need to increase housing supply, the best example we have is the financial crisis, because after that happened, we had overbuilt and prices went down, got very affordable, rents were cheap, house prices were cheap. It's that kind of ramping up of activity that is required. And if we keep saying, well, look, let's have some activity here, but not there, let's object to this one, but agree with this one, you're never going to get to that mass movement effect that actually makes the difference. And the effect needs to be to actually dampen prices. I mean, that is what the objective has to be. A lot of people aren't happy to hear that.
This supply is never going to deliver an affordable supply. The rents that they are coming in on, £2,000 a month for a one-bedroom apartment,
Of course it will.
but the demand is so high that there is no point. At what point is there going to be enough of these apartments delivered that will actually bring down prices? And they will do nothing for the rent down in Mayo or Sligo or Mullingar.
This is a 2007 conversation. It gets to a point where prices do drop. I mean,
but
we have history to prove this.
They're not going to deliver a point. And also, if we look at it, what happened in the crash was actually that prices went so high that they caused a crash. So is that where we're heading to again? Another crash? You know, and also a lot of property in the last 3 or 4 years.
We could be heading to another crash, Karl. You're nodding at that.
I've always agreed that you know, you have winter and summer, and
well, because prices are becoming so high that no one can afford them anyway without being leveraged, and that it just can't be sustained.
It's not so much that's not really the dynamic. What it is that there's so many signals in the market to create supply that everyone gets in on it. And it's almost like this lemming effect where the whole market starts to shift in a certain direction and you go into hyper supply. It's an idea that is well established in economic theory and in economic history. And what happens is it's really difficult to tell where you were. So like if you were driving in Galway in the night and there was no road signs, no GPS, you wouldn't necessarily know when you got there, but suddenly if you arrived, you'd be like, wow, we're here. And property markets are like that. You can't always see when you've hit the equilibrium. And because of this, they tend to overshoot below and overshoot above. And so, yeah, a price correction is absolutely expected at some point.
Well, the government's stance on investment funds, cuckoos, vampires, whatever you might like to call them, was a key topic in the Dáil today, and tempers did get a little bit frayed at leaders' questions.
Do you know what your policy is doing? It's actually making a bad situation worse.
You have objected to about 6,000 houses. Sinn Féin have objected to them.
Please, now the
and
time
voted against them happening.
I'm fed up with this Taoiseach lying about what Sinn Féin councils are doing.
Do not
they are
accuse the Taoiseach.
downright lying.
It is not acceptable to accuse any member of the House of lying. I would ask you to withdraw that claim.
Not withdraw it. I'm more than happy to substitute willingly misleading the House for lying. It's the same thing, Taoiseach.
Thank you.
I have to be honest, I'm never quite unsure what the difference is between accusing someone of lying and accusing them of willfully misleading, but those are the Dáil rules. Fionnan, Sheahan, I sometimes find all this now a little bit tedious, all this he said, she said about who's actually responsible for housing delays, because all the round doesn't actually get anything done, does it?
You're kind of at the situation now with housing where you were with the health service 20 years ago. Every couple of years you get a new minister arrives, he comes in, he says the situation is very bad, I'm going to develop a new plan. A la Micheál Martin back in 2001, 2002 with his National Health Strategy. You now have Darragh O'Brien with Housing for All. And then you give that a couple of years and you see, will that improve the situation? Ultimately, it's something that, you know, it's never really going to be completely resolved, as Karl says, unless something happens.
So do we need
the market to an adverse effect.
Do we need a sláinte of care for housing then that stops this thing lurching from
You
one
probably
to
need something that's getting greater consensus than Housing for All is at the moment. At the same time, you'd have to say, to be fair to Darragh O'Brien, he is in power. He is willing to take decisions and stand over them. There are other people who are either not willing to take decisions or not willing to go into power in the first place, and therefore will never be in a position to make such decisions. So rightly or wrongly, we'll measure how he's getting on. Like you got to give him a little bit of time. They have had that dramatic disruption of the last 2 years. Yeah. Nonetheless, when you're seeing local authorities coming in with zero social housing in a year, you really got to wonder, is the system in any way equipped to deal with this?
Owen O'Brien was on the plinth of Dáil Éireann today talking about that daft report, and he was asked what he's going to do to actually bring rents down, and he didn't necessarily have an answer to it. He said he wants to have the 3-year rent freeze, and hopefully there would be more supply in the meantime, and he wants to give a 1 month's rent credit by way of a tax refund, but that he didn't actually have anything to make rents any cheaper than they actually are. Does that mean that there's actually a bit of a hole in the Sinn Féin proposition?
Well, the Sinn Féin proposition is that you ramp up supply more than the targets that are there in Housing for All, than the government's strategy, and that in effect, depending on what way you crunch the numbers, anywhere between double or 50% more than the government is saying can be provided. The issue there is there sufficient builders in place? is there? Yeah, the house price inflation in terms of the supplies that you're going to use for that, and so on. The situation has changed though in the past 2 years on a number of fronts. We are this week 2 years on from the general election, which people remember as the housing election, but actually if you look back to 2016, that was also the housing election. It was just, this one was the housing election for slow learners in Fine Gael who didn't realise that actually the same thing had happened to them twice in general elections. Things have changed, the economic situation. I mean, obviously COVID stepped in and did disrupt things quite dramatically, probably changed people's perspective about what they regarded as a home and a housing, but also our economic prospects as a nation have changed quite substantially, so we do have more revenue available now to build more social housing.
Karl, how is rent actually going to come down other than with the sort of correction, the crash you mentioned?
Well, we've seen it happen before. Like rents have come down. In fact, leading into the pandemic, rent prices were calming. And it was actually only when we went into the pandemic that they started to recover and then do so quite strongly. So this idea that rents are a one-way trip, I mean, trees don't grow to the sky. You know, they rise, they fall. But the idea, and I suppose it's the main flaw that I would see with a lot of solutions, is that the state can jump in and resolve this. I think the state can be a really good facilitator, can create an environment which allows all of these things to take place. But if you look at 2019, which would have been, say, the last somewhat normal year, in that year the government got 1,000 Part 5 houses, which were built by developers, 2,000 local authority homes, 2,000 approved housing body homes. In 2021, Kieran and Glenveigh built 3,000 homes between them. They delivered 50,000 more homes in a pandemic year. But at the same time, local authorities, 31 local authorities, thousands of people working in them, you know, they have a €2 billion budget and they're not even matching just two companies. So thinking that this can somehow be solved through government, it's just it's golden era fallacy. There's actually a fallacy to describe it where you believe that back in my day this was, you know, this is how we did it. It doesn't work.
Karl kind of wants to leave things go, you know, to the market. They'll rise and fall, as he says. They'll come and go with the summer. People's lives are devastated through that. We have had 30 to 40 years of failed housing policy that has been utterly reliant on the market. At the height of the Celtic Tiger, there was only 6% of housing was social housing. Currently, at the moment, we're in a similar situation. Local authorities, he is right about this, are building very, very little. That is the reality. The government has been...
Why is that?
They have the money. Look, the money's not... it's them.
Well, the issue is that they were essentially cut for 20 years of their capacity. So they actually don't have the architects, the quantity surveyors. They don't have the capacity.
So they should be the builder.
They should be the builder. I would argue we actually need a state construction company.
That issue goes back to the 70s.
That is what we need to develop the homes, because at the moment the government is completely reliant on the market.
So
but you asked about rents.
Yeah.
There could be something to be done to reduce rents. In Berlin, they introduced a measure which actually required landlords to reduce rents actively 20 to 30%. I think we need to be looking at that. I think we need to look at measures like, for example, there was 3,000 tenants issued a notice to quit last year. 3,000. And part of what is going on is landlords are churning tenants.
60% of those, by the way, were landlords leaving the market. And that's a question that needs to be answered as well.
Yes, but they were churning and getting then in higher paying tenants.